In this lesson, we're going to be connecting to a testing API. So loading the contents of the API, also making some clickable buttons. So depending on how many items there are, how many users there are within this database, we've got the number of pages, the total and page, so we can create these indicators. And these are all dynamic, so depending on the content that we're getting back, they can change as the content would change. So all of the content, we're outputting the user information as well as the user's email addresses within the list. It's going to be part one of making a request to a testing API. We're going to start by setting up the HTML file. We've got some standard HTML elements to create the interaction, button clicks, and an input and an output field, as well as linking to the code.js file that we've created. And that's selecting the page elements and then also adding in the event listener for the click of the button. So click the button and just test to make sure that the console message is outputting the message of ready. So going over to a website called reqres.in, and this is an endpoint that you can test your front-end code against. So you do get fake data, and it allows you to try out making requests to the endpoint. So in order to make the endpoint request, this is the path. So there's a number of different endpoint paths. So let's copy the URL, and I'll go back to the documentation and load in the URL and make the initial request to it, and then return back the JavaScript object, and then we can take a closer look at what we've got available within this API. So I like to typically copy the endpoint that I know that's working within the code, just comment it, and all of the data is going to be after the path to the URL /API/. So that's the base URL that we're going to use. I'll give it a name of base URL. And now let's make the fetch request to the base URL. And we're going to update and add in the parameters. So one of the parameters that we're adding is going to be the user's value. So let's create that parameter there and then put together the base URL plus the parameter in order to construct our URL that we're going to be making the request to. So taking the base URL and then adding together the parameters that we want to pass. And now let's make our fetch request to the URL. And then we've got the promise. So we've got the response object within the promise. And returning back the response object using the JSON method. So we're going to get the content back as JSON. And then the next promise is where we can get the data content. And then making use of the data content within the console, let's log it out within the console and make sure that we're getting some data back. So we click the button, makes the request, and this returns back the data. So in this case, what we're doing is we're connecting to and we're getting the users with a page of 2. And if we want to just get the list of users, so there's a number of different pages that we have per page, total of pages. So we can create a way to navigate through all of the user list. And there's also to get the single user. So we can request the user by ID. And then within the user list, within the data, we've got each one of the users has ID. So we can make a request and get the information about the user back from the request. We also have other options as well where we can create a post, and that would be posting to a user and then returning back the ID. So making the request to the users. We can also update a user, so updating whatever the user value is and sending a patch method to it, and that allows us to make an update to the user. So there's a number of options here that we can try out. So let's go ahead and create a request, and we're going to list out all the user pages, and then we'll create an interface to select the user information, and then also create and add new users to the list as well. So quite a bit that we're going to cover, and start by creating the list of the page values. So let's see what happens when we just select the users API and do a click. So that by default returns back page 1, and we also see the total of pages and the data for this current page, and then per page it's returning back 6 items per page. So let's output that content, and we'll create an object that's going to hold the page data, and this can be an object so we can track whatever our current page number is. And I'm actually going to make this shorter, and I'll call it app, and then we can have under the page for the app, we're going to start out at page 1. So it's going to make the request to page 1 for the users, and the parameter again is going to be page. So if we have a parameter for page, then we know we need to load that page information. So setting up a function in order to handle the loading of page load data. And because our page object is global, so we're not going to have to update that. So when we load the data, that's going to output the contents on the page itself. So this is also where we can have a fetch request that's going to make the request to the data. And it's going to be loading the parameter for users and keeping in mind the same structure that we have. So taking the users and then whatever page, and this is where we're going to add in the value for app page, for the app page object. So currently the value for that is going to be 1. And let's simplify that. We're just going to load the data. So it's going to call to the function that's going to load the data, and then this is where we can create the output, where we're going to build the page object. And we want to build the page object from the data. So it's going to be building the page from the data that's being returned back from the endpoint. And in order to build the page, so I usually do like to have the console log of the data so that I know that what the structure of the data that I'm looking at. And within data, we can loop through all of the items. So let's create that first, where we're going to create the loop through of data, and then data, and using for each, creating the loop through each one of the items. And this is going to have a user information, and then we can console log out the user object. And I'm also going to set this up to automatically load. So window, and we're going to listen for DOM content loaded. And once the DOM content has loaded, then the event is going to fire off, and it's going to just fire off the load data function. So that's outputting it to the page. And if we don't have any other functions here, we can just shorten this statement. So it'll just automatically do a load of the data whenever the page loads. So there's all of our data. So now it's up to taking the data apart and outputting it on the page when we're building the page. So we're going to have to create elements again. So let's do that, where we'll set up the ability to make node, and then the parameters that we want to pass in to make the node. So we need the parent that we're connecting it to, and also the node type that we're creating, and then the content of the node itself. And that's where we can create the element and then also return the element, just as we've done within the earlier lessons. So we're going to be constructing the full object information and outputting it on the page, and then including the content of it. So for the user, and What else we'll do is we'll clear the inner HTML of output so that this is going to be just loading a fresh page of content. So the first item that we want to list out here is we want to do the first name and last name of the user and pass that over. So this is all contained within the user object. So we can get the first name, we can get the last name. So let's start by creating our first div, give it a name of div1, and just using the same structure, we're going to make a node. The parent of this node is going to be output, so it's going to be directly attached to output. The type of node that we're creating is going to be a div, and then the content is going to be, we'll create a separate variable value for that, and using the backticks, selecting the user information, so we're going to do the user, and let's do first underscore name, and wrap this within the $sign and the curly brackets. And then we'll also add the last name to that as well. So that's last name. And then let's also include the ID. So that would be the user ID into that first part of the content. So that's going to be represented by HTML. So when we make the node, let's add content to it. And this is just going to be constructing the element using the document, create element, and the element type is going to be under the node type variable. And then we're taking the parent object and appending the parent, the element to the parent. And then the element, the inner HTML of the element is going to be equal to whatever the content is that we passed in. And then we can also do a return of the element. And just to have something different, let's return it, and we're going to use the append child. And the difference between append and append child is that this is going to construct the element and has a response or return of the object that was just created. So that's where we're able to pass it back as div1, and now we can access div1 within the console. So that just shows us what div1 is being and what it's being returned. So we've got the content being output on the page. Let's also add in a second line. So creating div2, and let's have this div. So calling it, or I'll just call it HTML2, and to be consistent, I rename this to HTML1. So the content that we want within the second div, so maybe we want to have the email address. So that's just under email. And also let's create another one that's we can use as an image. So that will be the other one that we'll create, and that can just be by image1. And this is going to be image tag, and then there's no content that we're sending in there. And I'm going to log out into the console, the image. And this actually should be HTML2. That's where we're throwing the error. So there's our image, and let's take the image1 and set an attribute, and the attribute for source is going to be whatever we've got path for the avatar. So that's going to be the user avatar within the user object, so avatar, and I'll save that. So adding in the source images there on the page. And then also we're going to add in the additional options for clicking to the other pages that we have content on. And then we'll add some simple buttons to the bottom to go to navigate to the next page. And of course, we can apply styling afterwards. So also within the initial request where we're building the page and where we're getting the page data, that object already contains the information that we need. So we've got per page, we've got what page we're currently on, the total, and as well as the total pages that we have available. So we can loop through and we can output the number of pages and have those as indicators at the bottom of the screen so that the user can switch through and they can get the different pages of users and data. So let's create a loop where we've got the data total pages, and this can be a for loop. And while it's less than data total pages, and then increment I by 1. And this is where we can add to the bottom. So let's construct a div, and this is going to be our container div. So this is where we can add in the page content. So just make a blank div at the bottom. And then we're going to be attaching the indicators within this div. And we can, for now, we can create them as spans. So selecting and creating a span. And this is going to be with the value of span. And the content that we're sending in there is going to be I plus 1. And it's going to be appended to div3. So that gives us the indicators at the bottom. Let's go ahead and add in some styling. So they're really small and hard to see. So let's update them and update the display to inline block. And also adding in some margin for them, as well as border. And also add a border radius as well, so that they're slightly rounded. And going down to where we created the spans, take the span using class list add, and add the class of IND. So that way they're more visible. And actually I'm going to also do a text align to center align the text content. So that way we have an indicator of the other pages, and the user has the ability to click through and to move to another page. So let's also select that and add an event listener. So add event listener, and the event that we're listening for is going to be a click. And if the page does get clicked, then what we want to do is we want to build the page and actually load the data and update the app page value to whatever we've got for the I as we're looping through I plus 1. And then all we have to do is call the function to load the data. And that's going to initiate and trigger the loading of the new page. So whatever number of pages we have, we can filter through them and we can go to the different pages of content. So also let's, in the next lesson, we're going to add the ability to click on the user and see more information about them. In addition, before we conclude, let's apply some styling to each one of those. And we'll add a border around it, so that they're more distinct between the different elements. And I'm setting the top and bottom margins to 10 pixels, and also to all of the elements on the page. Gonna add the box sizing and the border box. So going into where we create the main container for each one of these. And since we don't have a main container, we've been adding it to output. Let's create a separate container, and we'll call it output 1. And using the same structure that we have, we'll append it to output. This can be just a blank div, and this is where we can hold the contents. And then within output 1, and this can just be up within here. So every time we're looping through, we're going to be creating another element, and that way we have something that we can apply the styling to. So this is going to be the main container. So output 1, and using class list, let's add a class, and the class that we're adding is going to be the box. So that will apply that more of that box type styling to the element, and also text align. We can center align it. Also set a default width to 80%. So now our content is nicely aligned. And also I'm going to align the bottom part there where we created the div 3. And to div 3, I'll also add in that same alignment so that that gets centered as well onto the page. And then those are still clickable. And we can also update the indicators. So setting the cursor to pointer. And let's do. Hey, the tasks for this lesson are to connect to the API and get the JSON data back from the API, and then generate the page elements dynamically using the data from the API, and also create the clickable page options for users to be able to interact with the data.